The third covenant that we can look at, these 6 major covenants that God extends to humanity, the third one we come to is the Abrahamic covenant. I'm going to touch on 3 parts of this covenant as well. And we'll start where it starts. Genesis chapter 12. This is where the Abraham narrative begins. And what we find is God coming to Abram. His name isn't Abraham yet. His name's going to actually get changed in chapter 17. It's a covenant name change. Where we meet Abram in chapter 12, his name is just Abram. And it says that God called Abram to leave his country, his people, his family, and to come to a new place where God will make a new family and a new nation for him. This is the call of Abram. And what we see going on here is God meeting another covenant partner and inviting that covenant partner to become part of the salvation plan that God's bringing to the earth. Now, what's happened between our last covenant partner, Noah, and Abram? Well, again, God started with Noah to open a man with a family up to the world, and we find that within a chapter or 2, by Genesis chapter 11, already the earth is beginning to rebel against God again. Noah starts things off again, but by the time of chapter 11, the Tower of Babel is happening, and people are once again uniting against God and trying to build this tower really to get to heaven, to try to become God again. And God has to bring judgment again as they refuse to keep covenant with him. So what we have is Abram is the next covenant representative that God finds to work with. Started with Adam. God was opening that up, and it got collapsed by sin. God finds Noah, wanted to open that up to the world. Again, collapsed by sin. Now, God's third covenant partner, Abram. God, he has to know, is Abram trustworthy? Is he faithful? And so he calls Abram to come to a new place without his family. Let's remember what we talked about with corporate solidarity a bit ago. If you're Abram and God says to leave your land, your clan, and your people, it's basically like saying, leave yourself, right? We've talked about how personal identity is wrapped up with land and people. And he's saying, let your old identity go. I'm calling you to die to an old identity so that I can give you a brand new identity, calling, and purpose. And Abram faithfully goes. He leaves his land, his people, and he willingly follows God in trust to a new place as an old man with no kids, and just the trust in God that God's going to bring a new people forth from him, even as he and his wife are in their later years. As God gets Abram to this promised land, and it's quite a journey, when Abram gets there, he finds something he wasn't quite expecting. First thing he notices is that there's large people in this place that don't particularly want newcomers. And there's famine in the land. It doesn't seem to be a place of sustenance. And on top of it all, he is now older than ever with his older wife, and they have no children. In other words, what God promises, and the promises were clear in Genesis 12, that first 3 verses, he promises Abraham will have children, land. When you put those together, you have a nation. He also promises him protection, and he promises him a great name. So really 4 promises to Abraham, 4 covenant promises. Land, children, protection, and a great name. As Abraham gets the land now, the land is not flourishing with food and not very inviting for him, and he has no children. So 2 of the key promises seem to be failing. And Abraham has a choice now. Does he trust God or not? In Genesis 15, we have one of the most beautiful key moments of covenant in all the Bible. Abram just is being honest with God. God's telling him, hey, I've made these promises to you. And Abram Here's the thing about the people who really know God in the Scriptures. They're not afraid to talk back to God. And by that, I don't mean they try to be disrespectful. I mean they're honest. They just share their hearts with God. They share what they're thinking. And Abraham's hearing God promise him these things again. And Abraham says, look, I know you've promised me the land, but how will I know that I'll possess it? Right? It's interesting. He's trusting God, and yet he's wrestling with his doubts. And he's being honest with God. God loves when his people express their doubts, the stuff in their head that just doesn't make sense, without letting it pollute their hearts. And that's what Abram does. He expresses his doubts without it turning his heart away from the covenant. And as he lays that out, God just meets him there, right? God says, hey, I get the question, right? It doesn't look like a great land, and you don't have any descendants. I get it. Tell you what, bring to me a 3-year-old goat, 3-year-old ram, a 3-year-old heifer, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. In other words, God says, bring a zoo to me, bunch of animals. And Abraham does. He brings these animals. And then he gets instructions, apparently, from God. Because what Abraham does is he cuts each of the larger animals in two, and he puts each half opposite the other. Now, we know from our last session on Introduction to Covenant that what's happening here, when you start cutting animals and placing their pieces symmetrically opposite each other, you're setting up the walk of death, right? This altar area where covenant partners stand in order to make covenant promises. The slaughtered animals representing what will happen to the human partners if they break covenant. So God has Abram set up this covenant ceremony, but not just one animal. Usually it's one animal. God has this zoo. Like, this is serious life or death promise here, right? And I would imagine Abraham was all ready to stand there with God and walk the pieces. Instead, what God does is once the covenant ceremony altar is set up, once the animals are there, once the walkway is in between, he puts Abraham into a, quote, deep sleep. Once again, God comes to his covenant partner and lets him rest. And it says that God then proclaims the promises once again. Promises land, promises descendants, even though there's no kids yet. They're coming. He even prophesies that Abraham's descendants will be slaves in Egypt for 400 years, but that they'll eventually come out, prophesying the Exodus, and will come back to the land. So he prophesies the next centuries of history of his people. All the while, Abram in a deep sleep. And then it says that a fire came down out of heaven and passed between the pieces. And on that day, God made a covenant with Abraham, saying, to your descendants I have given this land. You can't imagine a more powerful symbol of unconditional covenant love and promise than this. One party literally sleeping, while the other party walks the walk of death between the pieces of the animal. And it's God who walks the walk of death, lets his partner rest. We might say to ourselves, well, but God can't die. Well, can he? It's beautiful to see how this foreshadows the fact that God will actually, in the new covenant of Jesus, come as a human being who can die and does die for us as his covenant partners. So from God hanging his bow in the sky to God walking the pieces of the animals with Abram to eventually Jesus' actual death on the cross, the Son of God, dying for the sins, the covenant-breaking sins of his people, we have, from Genesis to Revelation, the entire Bible, a covenant God who's willing to put his life in the place of his covenant partner, to give himself in the name of love. This is the God that we're in relationship with. The last thing we'll notice is in Genesis 22. So what happens? Remember the 4 promises. Nation, land, protection, and a great name. Now how does God do on those promises, right? Well, we know that, in fact, he brings the promised son Isaac. They have a child, this child of promise. We know that eventually he gets them into the nation. And finally there is a nation of Israel. So God comes through on those promises. We know that he protects Abraham. Abraham lives a long, rich life. He gives protection. What about a great name? That fourth promise, does God come through on that? Well, how many people do you know that, how many human beings can say that 3 of the major world religions have come forth from them, right? Jews, Christians, and Muslims all look back to Abraham as the father of their religion. It wasn't too many years ago that Time magazine put Abraham on the cover. I think it was 2002. So ask yourself the question, how many 4,000-year-old guys do you know get the cover of Time magazine? That's a pretty great name. God clearly has given Abraham this renowned name of respect all over the earth, centuries, millennia after he lived. It's fascinating how thoroughly God came through on these promises. In chapter 22, however, God has one final test, and it's this. Has Abraham allowed the gift, namely his promised son Isaac, to become an idol? Only one way to know, and that's to see, would Abraham be willing to give that gift back to prove to his own heart, as well as in his relationship with God, that the gift has not become an idol. And we know the story. Abraham taking that long, lonely 3-day walk up to Mount Moriah with his son, knowing the whole time that God had asked him to sacrifice this son. You got to wonder what Abraham's thinking. Why would God take me through all this pain, all these years, make this part of his covenant promise, and then ask me to sacrifice this son? And I got to believe that in Abraham's mind, he's also wondering, why would the God that I understand to be a God of relationship ask me to destroy life? Right? A lot of things must have been going through his mind on that 3-day journey. And yet he faithfully just trusts God. Book of Hebrews, written in the New Testament, later says that Abraham was realizing that he could trust God because even if the sacrifice went through, he could trust God to bring Isaac back from the dead. That's how deep his trust is in God, that he believes in resurrection even. If God's made a promise, nothing will stop it. And so Abraham walks that walk, gets to Mount Moriah, builds the altar, puts the wood on it, all the time hoping, I'm sure hoping that he's going to hear, don't do it. And yet, he hears nothing. He binds Isaac, places him on the altar, and the text says that it takes Abraham right up to the moment when he picks up the knife. And in a sense, we know why this is the case, because it's not until the knife's picked up, maybe even raised, maybe even swung downward, before Abraham himself knows, would he really do this? Would he really obey God? And it says that as he picks up that knife, an angel stops the knife, and a ram, whose horns are caught in the thicket, is supplied instead of Isaac. In that moment, I think God's message does a couple of beautiful things. One, it reminds us that any gift from God that he gives us can, if we're not careful, become an idol in our lives. And that we've got to watch over that. When gifts become idols, when they become like little gods to us, they cause us to break trust relationship with God and begin to trust the idol. And therefore it causes covenant sin and brokenness and shame and all the things that leads to. So it's a reminder to Abraham and all of God's people, never let the gifts of God become an idol. But secondly, I think it's also a strong message that while other nations around Israel were willing to sacrifice, literally kill their firstborn children to their gods, our God says, no. I want the same level of commitment as that, but I do not want you to kill your children. God of love, a God of relationship. So ironically, the very call of God to sacrifice Isaac becomes a teaching against child sacrifice. that Israel is not to sacrifice their children to God. They're to trust him deeply, but without that. And so we see in the Abrahamic covenant the first beginnings of God's people, Israel. Through Abraham and through his promised son Isaac, God's now going to grow a family that within a few centuries will be a nation, the nation of Israel. And that will be our fourth covenant that we'll turn to, eventually the Sinai covenant, where God actually covenants with an entire nation of people.